Breaking with the past, the United States and Cuba are starting a new era by reopening embassies in Washington and Havana. After more than 50 years of frozen relations, how will this new chapter unfold? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Adrian Finnegan. After a 54-year-long break, Cuba and the United States will reopen embassies in Havana and Washington on Monday. The deep freeze dates back to 1959, when communist rebels led by brothers Fidel and Raúl Castro toppled the US-backed government and drew ever closer to what was then the Soviet Union. So can the neighbours now put their troubled half-century of history behind them, including a nuclear missile crisis and a crippling economic embargo, and coexist and cooperate in a civilised way? Al Jazeera's Caitlin McGee reports.
145 kilometres of sea is all that separates Cuba from the United States of America. For more than 50 years, the gap in economic relations has seemed too far to cross. The US and Cuba will reopen embassies in each other's capitals on Monday, a major step in re-establishing diplomatic ties cut in 1961, following the communist revolution led by brothers Fidel and Raúl Castro, which toppled the US-backed government.
Toward those who would export terrorism and subversion in the Caribbean and elsewhere, especially Cuba and Libya, we will act with firmness.
In 1982, Ronald Reagan consigned Cuba to 23 years on the state sponsors of terrorism list, pushing Cuba further into the cold. Secret negotiations began 2 years ago, leading to the historic announcement last year that prisoners had been swapped and Presidents Castro and Obama would push to normalize relations.
I've instructed Secretary Kerry to immediately begin discussions with Cuba to reestablish diplomatic relations that have been severed since January of 1961.
In May, the Obama administration removed Cuba from the state sponsors of terrorism list.
This was always a political move. Everyone knows Cuba does not support terrorism.
It showed the country really is changing, and the relationship with the United States is really a new news for us.
Today, the famous old American cars still cruise the streets. Reminders of the revolution still adorn the walls. The old ways remain. But Cuba is on the cusp of change. It is one of the few countries where mobiles cannot be connected to the internet.
No. Internet, no. Email, yes, but not internet.
In a sign of things to come, the Cuban government has promised secure and widespread internet for all. And tourism operators are also preparing for what could be a flood of US tourists.
It will be good for, not only for me, will be good for the Cuban economy, but it's a really big challenger for Cuban operators, I mean tourist operators, because we have to be ready.
Money will rule. Eventually, I think it's going to be Americanized. I don't think there's any way you can stop it if the governments join.
Caitlin McGee for Inside Story.
So let's bring in our guest for what's said to be a fascinating conversation. From Havana, we're joined by Carlos Alzogaray, a former Cuban ambassador. In Washington, D.C., Larry Luxner, news editor of The Washington Diplomat. And also from Havana, Mark Frank, the author of Cuban Revelations Behind the Scenes in Havana. Gentlemen, welcome. Carlos, let's start with you. OK, diplomatic ties being restored on Monday. That's no mean feat. However, normalizing overall relations is another thing entirely. How difficult a task will that be? What are the obstacles? How long is it going to take?
Well, one cannot predict how long it's going to take. It's going to be difficult, obviously, because there is a long history of conflict, and there is an accumulation of problems that are basically of the U.S. making. And here is where the other difficulty kicks in, which is the asymmetry between the two countries. Because the United States is a big superpower, it might be difficult for the United States to withdraw some of the measures that they have taken over the years. Although President Obama has done at least two, which is taking Cuba off the terrorism list, and second, reestablishing diplomatic relations with Cuba. Still, there is the embargo, there is Guantanamo, there is the Cuban Adjustment Act. There are a number of big issues, but I would suggest that we also look at the small issues, because that's where probably the movement is going to take place.
All right, Mark, Larry, in Washington, D.C., do you agree with what you've heard? I mean, not everyone in Washington is going to be happy come Monday at the reopening of the Cuban embassy, are they?
No. However, I think it's fair to say that the clear majority of Americans do favor lifting of the embargo, certainly a restoration of diplomatic ties. We're going to see 500 people gathered at the newly minted Cuban embassy here in Washington on 16th Street. There might be some protests, but by and large, a vast majority of Americans want this.
Okay, let's get Mark's opinion on this then. Has the embargo, Mark, do you think, against Cuba over the last 54 years been largely counterproductive?
Well, of course it's been counterproductive. It's been counterproductive in terms of trying to reach the U.S.'s goal, as we all know. But it's also been counterproductive because in the end, it's isolated the United States in the region. And one of the main reasons Mr. Obama is changing the policy is pressure from Latin America and the Caribbean, if not the entire planet. So clearly it may have had a purpose or not in the past, but now it clearly does not. Now it's clearly not in the U.S.'s interest, and that is why they're changing it.
Mark, one has to wonder why it's taken the U.S. so long to act. This surely should have happened 20 years ago, at the end of the Cold War, when any threat, if indeed there was a threat that Cuba posed to the U.S., disappeared. Why do you think Cuba, the U.S. rather, had continued with its policy of isolation towards Cuba for so long?
Well, you know, many people think it's basically because Cuban American exiles and their representatives in Congress have opposed improving the relations. I think it's a little more complicated. I think there's a long history of anti-communism in Cuba, in the United States. Cuba is right next door, and it is run by a communist party. So I think there's a number of factors, but I think right now, at least, they're beginning to change, and that's very positive.
Carlos, what do you think has changed then to bring about, first of all, the talks and the restoration of diplomatic ties? I mean, US Secretary of State John Kerry said the normalization of relations with Cuba was long overdue.
I think that what we have seen from both sides is that both presidents have been creative, bold, and they have taken the long view. The long view is it's better for both sides to have normal relations and let whatever Cuba is going to be, what Cuba is going to be. Remember, Cuba is changing in very profound ways, at least for two processes, the updating of the economic model and the transfer of power from the older generation of revolutionaries to a new generation of younger Cubans. So these two changes are happening together now with the normalization of relations. That means Cuba is going to change. So let Cuba be what it's going to be, and let's take advantage of that. I think that's what the main thinking now on people like Obama and Kerry and others in the United States.
Carlos, you're a former diplomat. Give us an idea of what might have been going on behind the scenes. Who has driven this rapprochement? Is it Cuba or the US? I mean, the two were talking for a year before the release of American aid worker Alan Gross. They were holding conversations in secret. What was going on?
Well, I think for Cuba it was a tough decision. Cuba's traditional position was that there wouldn't be normal diplomatic relations until the economic sanctions or embargo or blockade, as we call it in Cuba, are lifted. Now, Cuba obviously took the practical and the pragmatic and realistic decision of saying, okay, let's start with diplomatic relations, because that will allow us to work with the American government on issues which really are important for both sides and on which we can work. And by that, what the Cuban government achieved was beginning to move the United States from a regime change policy towards a policy of normal relations.
Larry, what needs to happen?
From the American side, I think, is finally...
No, I'm sorry, Carlos.
Yeah,
Carlos,
from the American
carry on.
side, basically, I think it is a realization. Yeah, a realization that as Mark said, they were not getting anywhere. They were not obtaining anything. They were losing in many ways. So they decided to go. Diplomatic relations is important because they will have an embassy in Havana at a moment where Cuba is changing. And I think that is a very important factor in their decision.
Larry, you've been listening to all of that. What do you make of it?
Well, I think the timing of this is very interesting. The fact that the opening of embassies in Washington and Havana comes at the same week that we've concluded a nuclear deal with Iran. Clearly two countries with which the United States has not had relations in many years, and yet with one country we're making progress quickly, and with the other we're not. And of course with the Iran deal there's vast congressional opposition to this. I think the next thing that has to happen after the embassies is Cuba's reintegration into the world economy. With the opening of relations, that does remove a major stumbling block to Cuba's admission into the World Bank, the IMF, the Inter-American Development Bank, which didn't even exist at the time of when the embargo began. The United States is still obliged to oppose Cuba's membership, but it doesn't have to convince other countries to oppose Cuba's membership. And once Cuba's admitted into the World Bank, the IMF, and it has access to the capital markets, I think that'll be a boon to the Cuban economy. In addition, the travel ban, which is still in effect, may not be enforced very strongly, or maybe the Obama administration will turn a blind eye to Americans who choose to visit Cuba in violation of the embargo. We still have congressional opposition to the embargo, and I don't believe the embargo itself is going to be lifted as long as the Castros are in power.
Okay, all right. So that's what it's going to take as far as Congress is concerned, do you think, to get the embargo lifted?
Well, I mean, Helms-Burton is enshrined and codified into law. There's, of course, a lot the President has already done and can still do. The Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control has already authorized ferry service between the United States and Cuba. It seems that the Cuban government is the one blocking that. But going back to the issue of financial markets, Cuba is one of only 8 countries in the world that does not belong to the IMF. That I think is a major step that has to happen. And once the embargo is lifted, then of course Cuban economy can truly flourish. But still we have the issue of human rights. There is opposition to a lifting of the embargo, and you still have a very strong core of Republicans who will block the naming of an ambassador to Cuba. Some Democrats, like Bob Menendez, are also opposed to this. So it looks like the president will have to appoint maybe will do a recess appointment for an ambassador, or maybe we won't have an ambassador in Cuba for a while. And I think the embassy could still function even without an ambassador. I understand that the current chief of the intersection will be promoted to a charge d'affaires. So that remains to be seen.
Carlos, is Cuba willing to look at political and human rights reforms in its desire to forge this new relationship with the United States?
My answer to that would be that the Cuban government has always said, and I certainly think that it has the support of the majority of the Cuban people, that changes cannot be imposed from the outside. That doesn't mean that Cuba is not changing. If you take a look at some of the things that the Cuban government have done, there is a will to change things. One was the immigration reform. Now Cubans can travel anywhere for over 2 years without any problem, which they couldn't do before. The second is the opening up to internet. The government has announced broad plans to bring internet to everyone. So Cuba is changing politically, but because of its own dynamics. And this is something that is important to realize, because under pressure from the outside, the Cuban government will probably dig in. It won't give concessions to the outside world. But because there is a movement inside Cuba and a demand for expansion of democracy and liberalization, which is a Cuban pressure, that those things are going to happen, but because of that reasons.
Mark, is that something that you would agree with, that Cuba is changing politically, but because of its own dynamic and not due to any outside influence?
Yes, I would, in fact. I think a great deal has changed in Latin America and the Caribbean since the end of the Cold War. The only thing that hasn't changed is U.S. policy towards Cuba. I think as U.S. policy towards Cuba changes, Cuba more and more will become part of Latin America and the Caribbean. And as you know, in Latin America and the Caribbean, there's only multi-party systems. There's no other one-party system. So I think really a lot of the issue is the pressure that's been brought on Cuba for the last 54 years. As that pressure lessens, I think you'll see more political change here in Cuba. Where it's going, well, that is really up to the Cuban people. But clearly, I agree with Carlos. You know, there's clearly a forward motion in Cuba in terms of politics, information, etc., and I think that will continue.
Mark, do you think that history will judge the embargo then as unilateral and untargeted as it is, as an embarrassing blemish on US foreign policy?
Well, sure. I think in the long term, history will look and see a tiny little country that stood up to this huge country right next door. And in fact, in the end, the huge country did not get its way. I mean, clearly that incredibly powerful country had a huge impact on Cuba's ability to carry out the project that it wanted to carry. But clearly history will say, look, this little guy stood up, and that'll clearly be the case, yes.
Okay. Larry, getting back to the issue of trade, you were talking about the fact that Cuba is, one of 8 countries that is not part of the World Bank at the moment. Is Cuba, do you think, at a China 1980 moment? Is it about to become a market-driven economy?
Yes, except that Cuba's an island of 11 million people, cannot be compared to China. Maybe a better comparison would be the Dominican Republic, which is of similar population. I think that the importance of Cuba as a market is sometimes exaggerated. It is the size of Pennsylvania. It has 11 million people. It's got a very low GDP. And yes, it needs food, it needs import, it needs everything. But still, it's not that big of a market. I do believe, though, that U.S. business executives are very interested in Cuba. We've seen sales of food, which has been permitted as a loophole under the embargo. We've seen those skyrocket, yet in recent years, food exports have dropped. At the same time, tourism looks like one of the most promising industries. Just a few weeks ago, Carnival announced that it would soon begin cruises to Cuba, home porting in Havana next year. There's a huge pent-up demand, as everyone knows, for a desire of American tourists to go to Cuba, and that could also affect negatively some other islands, such as Puerto Rico, that would like that same business. At the same time, agriculture, construction, paint, the auto industry all stand to gain, I think, from a trade with Cuba. But still, it's a relatively small.
All right, but hang on a minute. There's perhaps a caveat here for those who might welcome warmer relations with Cuba, hoping that it would free up liberalization. I mean, decades of economic development and free enterprise in China and Vietnam haven't yet yielded any real liberal democratic changes, have they?
No. Maybe a better comparison would be Albania. You know, if you look at Eastern Europe, these economies were centralized economies. They did produce in some cases, huge political openings. In other cases, as you mentioned, Vietnam still remains communist. China is certainly still communist. But we still remember that Cuba is 90 miles from the United States, and in those other cases, you didn't see huge exile communities ready to move in and invest. In the case of Cuba, you cannot discount the importance of the South Florida Cuban exile community, which is interested in Cuba, which has family in Cuba, and which would like to invest in maybe a vacation in Cuba and even retire there. So Carlos, I think that's a substantial difference.
All right, Carlos, let's put that question to you. Is Cuba about to become, you say that things are changing there, is it about to become a market-driven economy?
No, I don't think it will return to being a completely capitalistic or market-driven economy. I think it will remain a mixed economy. What is going to happen, it depends very much on how developments take place. Developments are taking place in Cuba now, which are very important. One, the unification of the currency, the elimination of the double exchange rate, and the decentralization of state enterprises. That's in the economic arena. In the political arena, you will have the party congress next year, then probably reform of the constitution, reform of the electoral laws, and then elections in 2017. I don't expect something different from what is basically existing today before those developments take place.
Mark, there are a couple of elephants in the room other than the fact that Congress is hampering any effort at all to lift the embargo. One is, I suppose, is the issue of Guantanamo Bay, the naval base. The other is assets that belong to US nationals and companies that were nationalized by Cuba back when the Castro brothers seized control.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think a very important issue coming up now that they've normalized diplomatic relations is basically reciprocity. The Cubans say they really want reciprocity, and they probably mean it. What does that mean? It means in the case of nationalization, fine, they'll deal with that, but then the U.S. has to deal with the damage it's done to the economy. And that's a very difficult issue. So my own opinion is they're going to have to look forwards more than backwards, and they're going to have to be very creative in working out past issues. Precisely because, you know, the U.S. wants fugitives back, well, so does Cuba. The U.S. wants, you know, its money back, well, so does Cuba. And so when you start looking backwards, it gets extremely complicated. It's much better to look forwards as much as possible and be very creative with the history. In terms of Guantanamo, I just think it's an obvious issue. Guantanamo's in Cuba. It's not in the United States, and eventually they're going to have to deal with that. It may take a long time. I don't think it's the #1 issue at all. I think it's the last issue on the table. But it will have to be dealt with at some point. So what we're going to see now is the Obama administration and the Cuban administration trying to work out what they can on one track. And on another track, you're going to see Congress resisting a great deal of that. The more they work out on the presidential track, the more pressure there will be on Congress to change. Though I don't really see a big change in Congress until after the next election.
All right, let's get Larry's thoughts on what you just heard there, Larry. Is there much of an appetite, do you think, in the US for this reciprocity, as Mark described it?
I agree with Mark that Guantanamo is not going to be returned anytime soon, especially now with the increased threat from ISIS. I think there would be huge domestic pressure to keep Guantanamo as a military asset. However, there are some things we can move on. One is the Cuban Adjustment Act. You know, up for many years, Cubans who made it to the U.S. were allowed to stay and eventually apply for citizenship, when Dominicans, Haitians, and others, even in the same boat, would have to be returned. I think we may see the end of that policy pretty soon, because if we have relations with Cuba now, it would be very hard to justify a special treatment for Cuban nationals.
Carlos, we'll give you the last word. This is a win-win for both the U.S. and Cuba, then.
Definitely, definitely. And it's good for the world, I think. Listen, I think what's going to happen now is that Cuba and the United States are going to start working on those issues which is easy to reach agreement because they are obvious. Protection of the marine environment, the ecosystem, counter narcotics, which they already do, civil aviation. There are a number of issues, health issues. There are a number of issues on which the common interest is clear. They're going to work on that. So by expanding those areas where it's easy, they will expand, especially in the United States case, those sectors of American society that are going to see the benefit, the clear benefit of a normal relation with Cuba. So that will help when eventually they sit down to talk about the big issues. The big issues, of course, Guantanamo, the embargo, compensation, Cuban Adjustment Act, the subversive policies of the United States towards Cuba, like Radio Martí and Telemartí. All these issues are bound to be, let's say, postponed to a later moment so that they can build a cooperation relationship that expands later on. This is my prediction of what's going to happen.
Gentlemen, there we must end it. Many thanks indeed for being with us in Havana, Carlos Alzugaray and Mark Frank, and in Washington, D.C., Larry Luxner. And thank you for watching. As always, we welcome your thoughts on our discussion. You can get in touch with us through our programme page at aljazeera.com. You can post your comments on facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or tweet us at AJ Inside Story. From me, Adrian Finnegan, and the whole team here in Doha, thanks for watching. We'll see you again. Bye for now.